All right, so I guess the big news of this week is the SpaceX, or at least one of the big news. Of this
Did you
week.
watch the video?
I did. It was pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, I was like,
What video?
So for those who weren't aware, SpaceX launched a rocket, the Falcon 9 rocket, and they actually successfully landed their portions of the rocket lander that they hadn't previously landed.
On the moon?
No,
On Mars?
Re-landed them back on Earth, which is
So they
cooler, I
went
think.
nowhere. Okay. That's
Yeah,
great
so I
news.
guess-
I'm sorry. I'm really down on spaces.
Yeah. I know.
Okay. Go ahead. Keep going.
So anyway,
with the story.
they deliver their payload up into space on one side, but then the bottom half of the rocket comes apart and then comes back down to Earth
And
instead of
lands on-
crashing in the
on the
ocean.
It's like a big Lego.
well, they've done it like 6 times before, but this time the
They
video.
didn't kill anyone. Oh, this is great
Or
news.
explode on the launch pad, which is what
No,
happened
more
last
importantly, for entertainment purposes, the video stayed the whole time.
time. Yes. So
You
we
actually
have to watch
watched
the
the
whole
thing launch, land from space.
It's really neat if you're a nerd about that sort of thing. Watching a rocket in reverse is basically what it looks like. That's really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, they successful. It's useful in the sense that it's really cool and entertaining to watch. So who can argue with that, right?
And now that they have the video all the way down, it will be the basis of new video games in the future.
That's right. Rocket Lander. If you ever
3D.
played that game, it's gonna be
Yeah,
even
Lunar
better.
Lander from 1979 Atari.
That's right.
Oh,
Stand
yeah.
up.
The
We're
classic.
remaking it in virtual reality. That way you can really experience Lunar Lander.
Good times.
They were launching Iridium satellites,
Yeah.
like 12 of them or something like that.
Yeah, I knew they were launching a lot of satellites. I just didn't know what they were for. I mean, the real cool part of the story is how SpaceX is going to make it cheaper, right? Is the reuse of the rocket is going to make it cheaper to put stuff into space. So cheaper satellites, more satellites, that kind of thing. Maybe someday we'll be able to go to space for tourism after all.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Here's the thing. They've not relaunched one of them yet, so we don't know what their refurbishing costs are.
The reuse costs.
The reuse costs. I know in the case of the space shuttle, everyone was surprised about how expensive reuse was.
Yeah.
Like,
Space
turns out
insane. But this is a simpler thing, so I don't know, maybe.
It turns out going to space is really, really bad and really hard on your equipment. Just,
Yeah.
In case you didn't know. To me, space tourism is kind of there with flying rockets. It was a nice dream in the 50s, it was cool to see on the Jetsons, but
Speaking of sci-fi,
I don't know.
video,
I would pay for it. I'm just saying that. If I had, was rich enough to do it, I would do it.
I would pay for it, but the question is, how much can I pay,
I would, if I had the money, I would pay it. I think it's like $20 million or something to go up on the Russian ships. I would totally pay that.
If all I had
For
was
30
$9
seconds
million,
in space.
no, I wouldn't pay it.
I don't know. I can be poor forever, but you can only go to space once.
Yeah, we'll see. The speaking of cool footage, did you see the drones being launched out of the F-18s?
I did not.
They launched, I think it was 120 drones
Something along
in
those
a
lines.
swarm, and they also showed the not only the launch of the drones, but their behaviors as they were run by AIs. I'll put that in context. They were still narrow AIs, but they were self-regulating their flight patterns based on their instructions they were given. The final goal instructions. So they naturally formed swarm patterns, flocks essentially, and then got close to the target, circled around it, and then collectively decided whether to go in further, and they did. And it was very interesting. It looked very organic, oddly enough.
Was the idea
In a
behind the
horrifying
operation,
way
right?
if you were the
Yeah.
target.
So
So
were
it's
they-
very organic how they're going to kill me.
Were they launched or ejected? Was it just shot out the side of the F-16s and then they sort of figured it out later?
It looked like
or
they were
was it
dropped from below. I don't know if that makes much difference whether it was ejected or launched.
Okay.
No, they weren't fired out like a missile. So what do you mean?
Right.
No, they were let go out behind them.
But they didn't sort of match speed with the F-16 initially or anything.
No,
They
no,
just
no.
sort of
They-
fell away.
In fact, I imagine the F-18s had to
Slow down.
quite a bit because they were propeller-driven drones. They had pictures of them later on.
That's what I was wondering. You
They
drop it
weren't-
in the jet stream.
They
and
weren't
the
jet
F-16s
drones.
going really fast.
Not yet.
That's version 3.
Right.
Jet drones.
In a swarm. How terrifying would that be?
Yeah. Although I have a strong suspicion a craft that's less than a foot by a foot in size is not very effective as a jet.
I think it would probably just explode
But
in
if-
space.
but
right?
you-
That
you
way,
can-
right?
No, modelers do jets at that size,
What you're
but not because it's fuel efficient or a good way to move around.
what you're forgetting is the intercontinental speed of sound swarm. A
We all wait for that.
a swarm that can move at the speed of sound and travel continents.
That sounds terrifying.
That would be a missile, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Well, that would be like
Missile
millions of
swarm.
missiles.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, more. It would be more like taking a bunch of these drones and putting them inside a missile, and then have the missile come apart, and then instead of like having just like little bomblets or little parachute type things being delivered, you would have like drones coming out of it so that they can be more precise with their explodey parts.
Yeah.
That would be.
I
that
don't
would be
think
the
it
deal.
would
That
ever
way
really
it-
be a strong incentive to make them go the speed of sound. Because the whole idea is you would launch them into a country and let them take their own sweet time to fill the whole country's skies with everything all the time.
Yeah,
Just a
let them
constant
figure it out,
swarm
right?
of drones. Some of the video had sound. It was pretty interesting. It sounded like locusts or something like that. It was
really loud
from all
bees.
over the place. Yeah.
Some sort of insect thing. I guess that's a good analogy for it too.
Yeah.
Just infest a country with your
Infest the country with
technological
the-
death.
They're
Or
currently
comforting.
just being used for surveillance. That's their purpose right now. But
So
I mean,
are
you
the
can do all
Predator
kinds of
drones.
things. Yeah.
Turns out you can hook up a missile to just about anything.
Yeah. In the end, you could hook up.
Yeah, I could see Mike's point. These becoming tiny, tiny little bombs.
Right, and that way you don't waste any of your munitions going into the middle of the courtyard. They gracefully buzz down to the exact building you told it to go to with GPS accuracy and explodey classroom 3B. And then the next one, classroom 3A, and then the next one,
And we also
classroom 2B.
to contemplate the horror of drone-powered war.
Yeah, that's exactly
Uh-huh.
where that's going.
Yeah.
And you can say, okay, let's deploy these every 50 feet around the perimeter of this building, go. And they'll do it.
Yeah, it's comforting. So,
Technology is great.
yeah.
Suddenly I want to go into space.
Yes. See, space tourism doesn't seem that bad. after
Yeah,
that.
I would much rather asphyxiate in space than plenty of other different ways to die.
Yeah.
Well, there we go.
Yeah. They won't have drones in space. They'll have little rockets.
Yeah. Well, they kind of have to, right? Their
Yeah.
propellers don't work well in space, as it
Yeah.
turns out. They don't really do much. They just sort of turn.
Unless you had an air cannon. And you
Actually,
Yes,
propellers
that
and
makes sense.
human targets work great.
Well, I guess that's fair. As I
Yes,
slowly float into the propeller.
Yeah.
How is it that we went from space tourism back to war again?
Oh.
I brought up a story about it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Here we
It's
go.
John's fault, you monger.
It's all John's fault. All right.
So I shouldn't go into my predatory mice story yet.
Oh, I saw that. Let's do this.
It turns out scientists have figured out a way to turn on the kill switch in mice. There is, in fact, I guess mice generally don't act as predators. They're not.
Right, they're very passive.
They're not really carnivores usually.
Usually.
Usually, apparently, is the correct term because they figured out a way to turn on the genes that make mice predators. And they have these disturbing pictures of mice attacking insects. And
What do they have a taste for? Insects?
They're just showing them killing the insects because I think they had the sense not to put these mice together.
So they would
Mice
collaborate?
Hunger Games.
Yeah, so they don't have a mice versus mice battle, mouse versus mouse battle.
Was it like genetic or was it? done to
Sure,
living
what
mice?
details?
Yeah, a real thing, right?
Actually, no, it was they were stimulating specific neuron groups in their brains to make it happen.
So it's electroshock therapy.
Yeah, kind of.
That's all right.
Yeah. Well, they were messing around with figuring out how motivations and emotions work in mice. That can't be extrapolated bad in any way. But there we go. This is actually not a military story, as far as I can tell. This is Yale.
Yeah, they're just
There
trying to
could
figure out the
be
brain.
other reasons for this.
Well, could they switch it off again once they turned it on?
They don't say in the story.
That's
They
the part
generally
they
don't.
leave out.
They generally don't talk about the long-term
Impact on the mice.
impact on the mice in a lot of these mice related
Probably because
science
then
stories.
a lot of people would be very upset at what
Yeah.
happens to the mice in the end.
So yeah.
Hint, they all die.
Yeah, that's what happens to every mouse in the lab.
Mice do not survive long in the lab.
No. In fact, usually I know some folks that do that kind of stuff, and I mean not like out of their way to kill mice, but generally speaking, if you're doing lab experiments with mice, even if what you're doing to them has no adverse effect on them whatsoever, you want to study them afterwards.
Yeah.
Right.
So you end up killing them anyway.
Sure.
Right, because you got to do the autopsies.
Right.
And various
Or
other
draw enough
things.
blood for a sample or whatever, which will also kill them.
Eventually, sure. Not to mention that mice just don't have a terribly long lifespan to begin with. So.
No.
Certainly not the lab mice.
Yeah, and once
variety.
you've used it in a lab, it's not like you can go donate that to a first grade school and be like, here, take care of this mouse for 2 years, right?
Yeah.
In case that mouse suddenly has infectious cancer.
It
or something
depends
like
on
that.
what you did to the mouse, I guess.
So, yeah.
This one's a nightlight mouse. It glows in the dark.
Hooray!
Look, kids, everyone get really close.
This one we
Plutonium
turned on
mouse.
the predator genes.
Don't get your finger too close or I'll think it's a snack.
Patient 0. Ouch, it bit me.
Yeah. And the zombie apocalypse comes. All right.
Well, we hadn't done the prediction part of the show yet, so yeah.
Yeah, there you go. We got to save that.
We got to start up. We got to tell the audience this is happening. We do have Scott's predictions of the future today,
That's right.
which will come in the second half of the show, which we may clip to sooner rather than later because we also have after the show the Martin
Right.
Luther King
Celebration.
which will probably preempt the show, usually about by 5 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can get the board ready.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So should
They'll
we
play
do
a lot of music at the end.
Should we do station business and?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let him start. And we are back with Scott's predictions. Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Everything will die. That's my prediction.
Yeah.
Well,
Let's start off with
That's
that.
that's such a safe one, though. Given
yeah.
mortality and entropy and all that.
You know, hey, immortality's a long shot, but somebody's got to do it. That's all I'm saying. No, I guess I have a short, a medium, and a longer term prediction. Although they all kind of bleed together, so I'm not sure how legitimate it is to really split those together. But my short term prediction is not much is going to change in the next couple of years. I think that there's a lot of things that we hype up as being game changers, and I don't really think that they're there for the next couple of years. Like
iPhone 8.
iPhone 8.
That
AI.
changes everything.
Virtual reality.
That's right. Virtual reality. There's a lot of things that get hyped up a lot. I think virtual
The
reality.
resurgence of Yahoo.
Well,
They already changed the name.
That's a prediction no one's going to make. I don't think anybody's going to base that one off. But
Once Verizon has it, let's clip right along. Sorry.
There you go. No, it's all
I'm
good.
interrupting you here. Go ahead.
I do think that AI and stuff is cool and it's nifty, but it's not as useful as most people that are selling it, try to make it seem to be. And so I don't really think that there's going to be a whole lot that changes in the next year or two. One thing I do think that's going to change though is solar power is going to reach that point where it's just so much cheaper than everything else that it just sort of starts wiping out natural gas again, and will be. I think mainly our power source is going to be solar. 5 years from now, it's just that's just what it will.
Do you think it'll be grid solar, or do you think everyone's just going to go independent and throw stuff on their roofs?
Well, that goes into my second prediction.
Sorry.
No. It's good because I think it's unclear to me exactly which way it's going to go, but I suspect that right around the same time that solar becomes the dominant energy source is going to be about the time we start seeing rolling blackouts on the electric grid. And that's because I think most people are going to put it up on their houses, and they're going to sort of death spiral our electric grids, and the only people left on it are the people who really can't afford it. So then the infrastructure will sort of decay because no one's paying for the grid infrastructure, and the only way they'll be able to manage power is by rolling blackouts. So essentially, poor people are going to not have as much power as rich people.
Oh, so you mean intentional rollout?
Yeah, I mean they're going to have to do it to
Intentionally
manage
rolling
power.
blackouts.
They're going to have to intentionally start, cutting off power at 7 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night just to try to manage their capacity load. As a means of rolling their power and managing.
You're saying to
their
some
capacity.
degree that the current infrastructure, which is actually needs a lot of upgrades right now,
It's absolutely.
might not get upgraded.
Yeah, well-
Because if you're middle class and you're paying voters
Yeah. If basically
don't use it anymore, they don't care anymore.
Essentially, if the people who can
Yeah.
afford solar power will put solar power in their own little installations, and then they'll, divest themselves from paying for the grid. And they're really, those are the people that subsidize the ones who can't afford to pay for the grid. So once those leave the grid, you're left with basically people too poor to keep it running. And then that's when you're going to start to see, now the this tree hit this power line and it went down, and the only way we can manage to keep power up to anybody is by turning it off to somebody. And so we're going to start to see, I think,
Yeah, but rolling outages imply a capacity problem, but there's going to be lots of extra capacity.
well, for a
Whereas
while,
put
until all
that
that stuff fades out,
infrastructure.
right?
Well-
Until all your...
But if you have it in a connected grid to where you, as an owner of a solar power, are selling your excess power to the grid, then you might not have a capacity problem, but you have an extra source of income that other people don't.
Right, except for you also have to remember tree lines grow into power lines. And so you may have excess capacity in the rich parts of town and no way to get it to the poor parts of town because you can't afford to keep your lines up between the two.
Exactly, but
So capacity is a complicated problem, right? And I think
Yeah.
that, essentially the prediction
Where the
is poor people are
capacity-
screwed.
Although I suspect strongly that the utility companies will, a lot of them are very friendly to the buyback thing. I think they're all going to turn on that and
Yeah, that's already happened in like how Hawaii had to essentially turn it off.
buying back will not happen.
Yeah, they'll have to. And I mean, there's not really any, I think, debate on that one because they're definitely going to have to do something along those lines. I just think that it'll stop being a buyback program and just start being people running their own power, and then people who can't afford to run their own power just kind of get the short end of that stick. So that's my sort of medium term, conclusion on that.
And you're thinking like 10 years?
Yeah, 5 or 10 years, something like that.
Okay.
But I think it's going to start happening in about 5 or 10 years. Yeah, that's my doom for everyone.
And I suspect the commercial sector will probably move even faster than the residential sector will,
Right.
because it doesn't take if you even get a 20% decrease on utility bills, especially if they're in demand rate billing or a lot of the
Yeah.
triple type billing, it's going to be such an easy case to make that, you know what, I'll buy actually very little infrastructure costs to get the battery packs I need to run 24/7, and I get the cells on my roof, and I'm done.
Yeah, well, and since
Yeah,
it's a
it's-
lot easier to battery power one factory than it is to battery save the entire grid, the commercial industries will be much more willing to battery
Yeah.
back up their own systems as opposed to relying on some external power producer. I think, outside of data centers, I'm not sure there's going to be a whole lot of people who care much about the grid commercially.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be a lot. Yeah, as you
Well,
said,
the
a lot
data
faster.
center, though, can solve their own problem just by putting a power plant up.
Right.
And they already do in some places.
Which they may be the big buyers of the power plants that become defunct by the dying electric grids. Is just data centers. Like, hey, I can go buy myself a natural gas plant, and natural gas is basically dirt cheap because no one's buying it anymore. So, fun times for everybody.
Along the same lines, I suspect, actually Saudi Arabia and a lot of the places over in the Middle East already know this is happening. Petroleum's going to get cheap.
Yeah.
yes.
Really cheap. And that's not cheap in the I'm manipulating the market sense cheap, but like just flat out.
And there's only so much you can cut back on supply, right? Before you just have to essentially lay off your workers. And like OPEC has a political problem with cutting back on supply too far because their own countries aren't going to go for it very much. But yeah, petroleum prices will go way down. Coal prices will eventually crater too. Right?
Yeah.
And then natural gas.
And the reason I know that they know this is because they're investing very heavily in solar,
yeah.
which wouldn't make sense normally other than they know that there's a ticking clock on their own
Yeah.
money source.
I mean, not to mention that just running out of petroleum in the first place, is eventually going to be a problem for them.
That's
The
true,
running
but you-
out petroleum thing is kind of a generations in the future issue. The solar petroleum market bottoming out is a generation in the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even less than that potentially, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing you'll see is massive price volatility in the meantime, right? Where you'll see prices will crater and then skyrocket, and then crater and skyrocket again. 'Cause
I think
they'll-
skyrocket will be relative. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we'll see $3 gas again.
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it'd be kind of interesting because they'll have they'll cut back on supply because they have too much of it, and then that's they'll be like sort of lagging behind the market, and then it'll price up again because there
Yeah.
won't be enough oil in the market. So things will skyrocket way up, and then they'll have to crank up production, and then it'll crater out again. So
We'll see where that goes.
it's
I know
hard to
for a
predict
lot-
how that is going to go.
We're stable in that sense. We don't really use those phrases with the Middle East, more stable, but for certain other areas of the world where their total economies are dependent on oil in a much more closely tied sense, they can't stop producing petroleum, period.
Thinking like Nigeria, Venezuela,
Yeah.
those types of places.
They will do full capacity all the time, no matter what the price of the oil is.
Yeah.
They just won't stop. And so I don't know how much you'll see the skyrocket occur.
I mean, that's fair. That could be a case. But I do
Yeah.
think that solar is probably great in lots and lots of ways for managing our energy usage. But I think it's going to have some very dramatic effects, in relatively short period of time. 5-10 years, it's going to start being pretty wild following
I think
that effect.
here's something about solar, though. What you said is very, very true and applied to the United States. But when you were talking about rolling blackouts,
Sure.
in places where there are rolling blackouts, a small little solar panel that'll turn on a light is an insane advantage, and it's dirt cheap.
Right.
So I think in areas like that, you're going to start seeing these kind of small solar-powered widgets, or
Oh, yeah.
it's not a full solar power installation like you're going to have in the States, where people can afford it and they want to power up their whole house. It's a smaller scale thing where you're going to see something like, oh, here, this will power up, your fridge and your
Well,
Wi-Fi router, and you can charge a phone on
That's
it.
true, and I should qualify by saying I'm predicting based on the United States.
Yes,
I really have no idea
yeah.
what Canada, for
Yeah,
example.
here's
but
the
where I'm
thing
getting
that-
with that,
Some places, like so much of the third world, they're already going solar, have been for a while, for that very reason. They don't want to
Yes.
rely on the infrastructure. For the same reason they're going to cell phone and not doing landlines at all.
Right.
This
Also,
is
it's a
a-
lot easier to run the infrastructure for a solar grid.
and you
Like
don't
a small, tiny solar grid.
you
right?
don't need the both. Like a lot of people, the thought is, I say here, here, and why do I need a phone and a cell phone? Why do I need a
Right.
house phone and a cell phone?
Mhm.
And for a lot of people, that is the thought. Their parents never had a phone, and they were kind of the generation where they could get a cell phone or a phone. So they said, well, why should I even get a phone?
Yeah, well, if you came back today, and if you had, if Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone today, it wouldn't be a very useful invention, right? Because cell phones have
Exactly.
taken over.
Exactly.
But,
Exactly.
we have a lot of history in and like our electric grids are the same way. We have a lot of history built up in those grids.
Yes.
And some of that history is hard to change and hard to adapt. And I think that the solar market in particular is going to be quite troublesome for the U.S. I think you go into look in Europe where they've already been kind of thinking about this problem for a long time, or Asia, and I don't think you're going to see nearly the problems that you're going
Here.
to see in the U.S. But I do think in the next few years, yeah, it's going to be an issue. My last prediction is that I think within 20 years is maybe a little bit optimistic, but certainly within my lifetime, we're going to start seeing laws written to try to stop automation. In a direct sense, to limit the number of robots you can use in a factory, for example, or increase the number of people you have to employ to run a factory. Because I don't believe that the U.S. is politically going to be tolerant to unemployment above maybe 20%.
That's what I was going to ask. Are you talking about politically or socially?
I think it's an effect of the technology of factory automation. And it
Okay.
attempts to stop what factory automation is doing
I'm just
in terms of our
thinking,
employment.
do you mean
Right.
like a rise of the Luddite Party?
Yeah,
Like we had at the
something
turn
like
of the
that.
century, the 20th century.
Yeah, I think you're going to start seeing a lot of that, and worker protections that don't look like worker protections to us, but look like couched in terms of safety. Like, for example, saying all self-driving cars have to have all self-driving taxis
chauffeur or
have to have a
something,
person
yeah.
behind the wheel because he has to make sure it's safe.
Mhm.
Or like you must have a human watching every 5 robots on the factory floor for safety. And what they really are worker protection laws, but they are couched in terms of some kind of safety construction.
I
It's
could-
essentially an
I
attempt to
could see
stop
some of
automation.
that. I'm not going to try to predict politics because that's really tough. But the service industry is going to get hit really hard within the next 3 or 4 years, I think.
I could see what you're saying about. I don't see them limiting the number of robots or the amount of automation you can do. But I could see things like you said, where every 5 robots has to have a supervisor, which is a position that doesn't exist now. It was kind of just extra bureaucracy
Yeah.
to keep people busy.
In many ways, from a technological standpoint, they're probably make-work jobs, right? Jobs where you're watching the same thing for weeks on end and not changing anything. But
Exactly.
the intent will be to stop or limit or make more expensive the automation industrial automation that goes on as a probably vain attempt to prevent unemployment going up above certain kind of critical percentages. Because I do think once you get unemployment around 25% is when you start talking about revolution, historically speaking. And I don't think that many politicians are going to be a big fan of having people defenestrate them.
Well, and your consumer market drops like mad
Right.
once you start getting too much unemployment. And that sounds like an odd argument, but a lot of the powerful and wealthy don't want unemployment either.
Right.
Ironically, they don't want to have to hire the person.
And they certainly
But
don't
they
have to
want
pay
someone
for
else
that
hiring the person, because if someone doesn't hire them, they're not going to buy products and goods. And
Everybody's a fan of high wages until they have to pay those wages, right?
Yeah.
But political commentary aside, it's tricky. Once you get above a certain percentage, you start entering into the realms where things become very strange, both economically and politically. And I think that,
Yeah.
maybe it's not a technology prediction, but I think that's
So-
going to bleed over into the technology realm.
So given my weird prediction of the first time around, between the alt jobs that we can't even conceive of now occurring, do you see that peaking up at a certain percentage of unemployment before they start ratcheting back down again, or do you see it always staying high? Are all jobs gone forever?
I think there's that you start getting really hard to predict, but I think there's a very definite non-zero chance of just a total economic collapse in this, in some time, where everybody goes back to start over again, and they try to re-employ, from some sort of dead, Zimbabwe 1980s kind of situation where you just gotta scrap it and start over again. There's also a possibility that it comes out and everybody just changes and adapts and figures it out, and we're all better off in the end. But I personally tend to lean towards the first action. I tend to suspect we're more likely to collapse than to
It would have to be done
survive.
strictly through regulation to do a scratch over, because as soon as one country does it, the country next door starts giving out near free goods from AIs and robots.
Yeah, and then it collapses under the weight of it, right? Because I think by the time that one country, especially one as big as the U.S., starts to crash, you have a problem where everybody is pretty close to that threshold themselves, and then it sort of has a domino effect, which could be dramatic. So I feel like there's one of two ways you can go. Either it's very disruptive in the short term and everybody figures it out and goes or nothing good happens and the whole thing kind of collapses.
It's hard to say. And what's odd is right now the current trend is there's that push where these jobs are being lost, but the number of middle-class persons around the world is skyrocketing.
Right.
So
Well, a
it's
lot of those
simultaneously...
A lot of those middle-class jobs are essentially the middle-class jobs of America in the 50s, right? They're these factory jobs that have been
No,
moved
they're
overseas
service
in a lot
sector.
of cases.
They're not factory.
Well,
They're service sector.
That was my understanding, was that the service sector around those
Well,
jobs.
the manufacturing jobs are starting to decrease overseas. What's happening, though, is that enough people are now making enough money in the middle classes that the service sector is booming.
Right.
But the problem is the service sector only booms if you have a large middle class, so it's a catch-22 scenario. Now, will that sustain itself? I don't know. Is our large middle-class service sector a result of America's position in the world as a superpower, or is it because it's possible to have a large middle-class service sector?
Yeah.
Universally.
It's very...
There's no way to answer that until we find out.
Yeah, one way or the other. I think we're about to discover what happens next.
Can everyone just start paying each other? That's what it amounts to, because they're not making anything.
I'll give you some money if you give me some money.
The
please.
other thing we might see is a shift from the meaning of value from things to service. So I think we talked about this in one of our earlier shows, where instead of saying, oh, well, having the latest car, having the latest model car, and owning it and in your garage, that's not what the source of value is anymore. The source of value is having a person come and pick you up instead of having a robot come and pick you up. And
Right.
if you are
and we're
someone...
seeing that in the customization of things as well. It's I suspect, it's not my prediction show, sorry, but
No, it's okay.
in 10 years, you're going to be embarrassed to have the latest BMW, because I want the Jonathan model. I don't want the one everyone else has. But customization of that nature requires that either I do something or I pay someone else to make a version just for me that's different than everyone else's. So I don't want what my neighbor has, I want what I want.
Yep.
And that shift in viewpoint in what's important and what shows off class
Changes what value is.
changes what the value is. So I don't want the latest Nike. I want the shoe that no one else has.
But the problem that I have here is that
That's a service thing, not a production problem.
that attitude is sort of fundamentally a rich attitude, right? It's I have the money to be able to do this, and I think that
It would make no sense that everyone have that attitude, unless,
Yeah.
of course, one day it makes sense.
right, unless everybody is rich, right?
No,
Or at
it's
least-
not.
No,
it's not
no,
about,
that's the
it's
thing.
not. It's not about rich, because rich doesn't mean having things anymore. What rich means is being serviced. You can go and you might be able to go and buy a pair of shoes for pennies on the dollar. Think about it like this: you can go to Goodwill right now, today, and go and buy a nice pair of shirt, a nice shirt, and a nice pair of shoes, and nice pants, and everything.
Have an outfit.
You can have an outfit probably for less than $5. Definitely less than 10. But people don't go to Goodwill to buy things, even though it's not about quality. It's not about anything other than their image of themselves, their prestige. That, oh, if I go to Goodwill, that means I don't have the money, or I'm poor, or there's something wrong. Only those people go to Goodwill. That's the idea. So we have these things that are ubiquitous and available and cheap, but we still like the idea of the newest thing and the flashiest thing, and we're the first to own it, or we're the first to wear it, and we're the first to use it. That is going to change, where it's not about we are the first to own it or we're the first to use it. It's going to shift to, oh, this was made just for me. You can go to the future Goodwill.
It is a wealthy attitude. The poor will have everything they want. That's not good enough. The wealthy will have things they don't want. They'll go way beyond what you want to things you really don't want because it's extra.
Yeah, there's that kind of concept. There's a differential. And
I shouldn't say don't want, but things you can't imagine really wanting because you
But see,
don't really
the-
need them in any way, shape, or form.
But this is also predicated on this concept that things. I don't know if there's the right language for this, but that things somehow get like there becomes more of things, and I feel like it's just as easily that there could become a lot less of things, and in the sense that
It would have
one way is that
in
everybody
my
gets
opinion,
wealthier.
it would have to be a collapse of some for that. Because even if everyone was poor, you could still make billions of useless things and store them in warehouses.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that basically what the Soviet Union did at the end of the 80s, right? They
Yeah.
just tried to prop up their economy by building things and then throwing them away. And that's a sort of scenario that I think is not, there's definitely a non-bureaucracy for that kind of thing happens, where we simply can't afford to buy anything anymore. And
Yeah,
the great equalizer is if everybody has
free,
nothing.
even if it's free, it's hard to buy it.
Yeah. And you just can't make it, so it becomes harder to find, and so it becomes harder to acquire, and pretty soon you can't get it, even if it was even if there was zero cost to actually get it, or near zero cost to actually produce it.
Be interesting to see where that goes.
You know.
Yeah. That reminds me, off air, I got a dead project to tell you about.
Oh, well, that
I've been
sounds
working
good.
on for a while. But
All right. So those are my predictions. Doom and gloom for everybody. Poor people are screwed, and nothing really is going to change. But that's it.
Now you're
I
taking,
can't beat that.
You're taking the wind out of Mike's prediction.
Yeah, I cannot. I don't think I can beat that. I might just defer
So you gotta try harder,
next week.
you
No,
know?
I don't know.
I left room for environmental disasters and meteorite strikes. So maybe you got.
I
something
don't
there.
go there though.
That second one's space. He doesn't do that.
Oh, that's right. We can't go to space.
Yeah, I absolutely hate outer space.
Maybe just trees will fall everywhere. And everybody
Like
will just
my,
be
my
crushed
whole
by a tree.
world view ends at about 20 miles up.
No one this show has talked about environmental change, about Boston being flooded and
No, I thought about
20% of the earth being covered in water.
I thought about it, but it's hard to do technology about climate change.
Yeah.
Because you're
Yeah,
so
that-
much at the mercy of what
But
the Earth is just going to do.
to me, I see that as part science, and science touches technology. Technically,
Yeah.
we do science and technology.
I mean, I guess that's true. I just don't feel qualified to talk about it.
Yeah, me neither.
So,
You
and
know,
all
can
that.
we do technology opinion for a moment on this show? Like
Sure.
right now?
Do you have an opinion on technology?
I do.
When do we not do technology
Yeah, really.
opinion?
I was about to say. That's,
Well, this- okay,
that's an exception of any kind.
Typically, dear listener, we talk about news. So we talk about stuff that is in the news that has to do with the tech world, the tech infosphere, as it were, things that companies have done or feats that were accomplished. But I want to talk about last week's technology weather models, and specifically how it affected us here in mid-Missouri,
Yeah.
because there was a lot, and I mean a lot, of technology pouring out these models about how mid-Missouri specifically was going to get a lot of precipitation that was going to hit the ground with freezing temperatures, and we were going to have a big old ice
lot of ice,
apocalypse.
sure.
Wait, you weren't snowed in?
I was not.
But you know, if you followed the weather
And-
models really closely, they changed. You know,
Oh, they
if all you
changed a
did-
bunch.
If all you did was pay attention to the weather, as it got closer and closer, you saw it getting pushed out further and further as the weather models were better at predicting first.
Right.
The problem is that everybody looked at the model on Wednesday and said, you know, the ice apocalypse is coming, and then they never
Mhm.
bothered to look at the model again.
Well, they did.
Right.
But I think fear does a lot of influence on humans, and
And whether or not it was
Yeah.
fear or whether it was an
they didn't want to be the guy who said, "Oh, it's all going to be okay," because if they were wrong,
yeah.
they'd have been
And let me
crucified.
also be the first to say that all the official channels that were taken and the infrastructure leaders and all of the people that did, you know, there was an overwhelming response to preparedness, and I salute every bit of it. I'm not trying to go there either. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, false positives are way better than false negatives. in this
Absolutely,
particular scenario.
absolutely. Yeah, I think the community leaders did, what the utility companies did, what the people with the chemicals that put on the road and pre-treated and everything, all that response and what came out of all of that, I think was a glaring example of a good community trying to be prepared for what seemed like pretty poor outlooks. That being said, though, we got nary bit of it. And so I'm really interested in how y'all's feel about if there was some kind of technology problem. Because this wasn't just one TV station, this wasn't two TV
Well,
stations.
there is-
This
there
was
is- there is to some
NOAA, this
extent.
was all the local radar, this was everything.
You got to be careful with anecdotal evidence, but the prediction models, especially the distant ones, are based on past behaviors of the environment.
Sure.
And given that the weather is shifting towards the warmer, you would expect that it would always get the predictions wrong in one direction if, in fact, the environment, and it is to some degree, warming up as a whole. So they would be more likely to be wrong. They're more likely to predict the weather being colder than it really is than it is going to be warmer than it is.
But the other thing that I would say is that
And how do you adjust for that? You can't really, because the models are so, given how the AIs work to produce those models.
And the
Yeah,
other
it's-
part of it is, I want to say that today we can make those predictions. They're not perfect, but at least we can say.
Right.
I mean,
40, 50 years ago, you
Not
couldn't
even-
have any of it.
not even 40, 50 years ago. 20 years ago, if something like this happened, 20 years ago, it would have been like the day before.
Well, you'd get a day's notice, but I
Maybe
mean,
a
like,
day's
50
notice.
years ago, you may not even get that kind of notice.
Exactly. It's you wake up and you see it. So
Yeah.
that, I think.
So I think all of it is great, but there was definitely...
But to fault the model for being imperfect, I think we're never going to get a perfect model. And even though it was way off the mark today,
It
and
was way off the mark last week.
I'll give you that. It was way off the mark.
Every single person was
But
way
that
off the
doesn't
mark.
mean it's a
I-
problem, because
I
to
actually
have
contend
no mark.
differently than
Okay.
that. I believe the models were actually not that far off. The
No,
thing is
they
that
weren't.
the models adjust, and the further away from now you get, the less accurate they'll be,
True.
the less predictive they'll be.
But even hours before the event,
But here's
they
the
were
thing,
saying,
if you
you're going to
say-
get this, you're going to get that, and there was
Well,
nothing.
I looked on Thursday night, and it was like you get a smattering, you have a 40% chance of rain at noon on Friday. and a 60% chance of rain at like 11 o'clock at night, Friday night.
Uh-huh.
And we didn't get rain at noon on Friday. So what were
Right.
the odds of us getting rain at noon on Friday?
40%.
40%, right?
Right.
So
So
less
it wasn't
than
that they
half.
got it wrong. It's that they made a prediction that was a
Sure.
numerical percentage.
That's true.
And, you know, that we fell on one side or the other of that line.
Okay.
But, and the thing they were predicting, though, is actually very problematic because they were trying to predict an ice scenario.
Right.
And having to do with
Precipitation
thermal,
and temperature and pressure.
with
Yeah,
thermal
which gets more-
layers. Predicting snow is a lot easier.
Sure.
Whereas predicting
Everything
rain is a
is
lot
cold.
easier. But here you're trying to predict rain that freezes, and it's got that narrow
That is
band
correct.
where that occurs.
It's only plus or minus a couple degrees either way where you get the difference between water and solid ice or snow. So you're right. Ice storm is probably the worst thing to try and predict accurately.
But I still contend that the problem last week was less inaccurate forecasts and more that we reacted prematurely to those forecasts.
Right. So that
Rather
that
than
takes me back
waiting
to
for things
technology.
to resolve as they should.
So that takes you back to technology then. That's where I wanted to start off with it.
Yeah, and I don't know that I don't know enough about meteorology to know that you could make something better. I mean, it's possible faster computers or something might have been able to turn around models better, but there's weather is chaotic.
Yep.
And there's a certain element where you cannot predict beyond a certain percentage.
Too many inputs.
So yeah.
Okay,
and
see there,
very
see
sensitive
John,
to initial
see?
conditions.
That's an interesting idea.
So there's no way around it. I mean, if the future of weather is based on the individual temperature and wind eddies of every square meter of the planet.
Hmm.
And
And see, we are going to that model because I know I have firsthand account
We are.
of setting up weather stations in various places around mid-Missouri
And
for
because
that
of the new satellites out
specific
there,
purpose.
they're actually getting pretty good where they can detect the temperature of every square meter of the surface of the planet. But even then, what it's probably going to only do is it means that it's somewhat accurate 3 days out, and that'll be accurate 3.2 days out.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
okay.
not going to be a...
And I really do think, though, that the problem is
tough.
mainly our tendency to look 7 days out and go, next week there's going to be snow, and then everybody runs and buys bleach.
Yeah.
And it's I don't think that's a
Bleach?
fault of
Yeah.
the, or whatever.
Okay.
I
I
don't
think we
think
can
that's the
safely
fault
say,
of the model.
say on the show,
that people do that.
don't even look out 7 days. I mean, you can just for entertainment purposes, but
I heard
They
3
don't.
days is really the limit
Yeah.
to where you get any kind of reasonable idea of what's going on. That's generally as far out as
I don't know, man. I live in the now. I wake up every morning and I say, okay, what's the weather like today?
Fair enough.
And after that, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, tomorrow's a new day.
I usually only look when I hear that there's going to be a storm, and this is very predictable. Every year there is a storm that people wildly freak out about, and
That
it's kind of-
underwhelms. Yeah,
it's kind
yeah,
of a
yeah.
60-40 proposition as to whether or not that storm actually ever delivers. And
Okay.
I think it's mainly just that people.
So around the room
Right.
then, including myself here, not a failure of technology, not a tech problem,
No.
not a tech issue.
I
No.
would say that
It was humans reacting to the best data they could come up
Yeah.
with, and that maybe technology can't come up with a better
And the
answer.
other part of it is, and this is my personal opinion, is that we had that small ice storm a couple of weeks before, about a month.
did.
About a
That
month
took
before.
took everyone by surprise.
Exactly. That
Yes.
took everyone by surprise. So everyone was kind of freaking out. Oh my God, we're gonna have another ice storm.
Yeah, because that last one didn't even have a lot of precipitation involved.
Exactly.
It was like this freezing fog that sort of came out of nowhere and froze the town out. And this one had a lot of water in the air.
which,
So I
which
think-
ironically took again that very narrow scenario to happen.
Yeah.
It is a
Exact-
freak of nature almost when it occurs.
Exactly. So I think if it wasn't for that initial storm, the very first ice storm, but we just had this prediction that there's going to be an ice storm tomorrow, people would have freaked out
We
a
need-
lot less.
We need
Well,
to get
we've
off.
got to cut out early and let Kelvin take the reins. So once again, you've wasted another 56 minutes listening to Tech Radio. Tune in every Monday at 6 p.m. Central. Thank you very much on 89.5 FM. Good night.
Good
Watch
night,
us in
everybody.
Fisheye on YouTube.
Yeah. Good night.
Night.